welcome to today's presentation. I'm Susan Milazzo, CEO of the California MBA, and I'm happy you could join us today. I have partnered with the New York MBA to provide some content surrounding affordable housing issues and housing supply. I'm very happy to have this partnership with New York MBA. They do a lot of great content on affordable housing, and I was happy to work with them to put together today's presentation. I am happy to welcome our speaker today is Daren Blomquist with auction.com. He is going to be talking about how distressed property disposition helps in neighborhood renewal and, of course, increases our affordable housing supply, which is, I think, a very important topic, especially in today's market. So, Daren, I would like to turn it over to you and start the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Susan. And thanks to the California MBA as well as the New York MBA in allowing me to present here. And I think it is a very important topic, and it's a topic that sometimes is a little sensitive and sometimes is overlooked. So hopefully, though, we can shine some real light on how responsible disposition, which doesn't always get talked about a lot, can actually be good for neighborhoods and be good for affordable housing supply, which is a huge challenge in today's market. And so with that, I'm just going to jump in. And the first topic we're going to talk about is, before we get to responsible disposition, we're going to talk about the success of responsible loss mitigation strategies. And we've seen these responsible loss mitigation strategies take hold over the last few years, and they were really, I would say, inspired or triggered by the shock of the pandemic. The shock there caused servicers and policymakers to step up, and they really did step up to the plate and were adjusted on the fly in terms of adjusting loss mitigation strategies to respond to the moment and respond to the crisis that was happening. And so I wanted to spend some time framing our conversation with those responsible loss mitigation strategies, and then transfer that over to, okay, well, we've seen the success of responsible, and I'll define responsible here in a few minutes, loss mitigation strategies. We need to carry that over to disposition. And I think that's important. And the fact that not everybody, unfortunately, is going to be saved from foreclosure by these loss mitigation strategies. So that's where we're going. But I did want to start with the success. And by the way, just recently, the CFPB has come out with new rules or new revisions to Reg X that cement many of these responsible loss mitigation strategies that we've seen inspired by the pandemic into more of a long-term situation for mortgage servicers. And so that success, I think, is carrying over, and we're going to see that more of a long-term. This is not just a response to a crisis, but some of these strategies are good for the longer term and for just in normal market conditions. So first of all, I mean, the main point here on this slide is looking through the lens of forbearance. And this is data from ICE and Intercontinental Exchange, formerly Black Knight. They're showing that there were nearly 9 million loans that entered forbearance or have entered forbearance during the pandemic and after the pandemic. But what's amazing is this small sliver there on the right-hand side that shows only 1% of these nearly 9 million loans have been foreclosed on, have ended in foreclosure. And that ends up being about 98,000 properties, which is a drop in the bucket compared to the 9 million that entered forbearance. And so these loss mitigation strategies, responsible loss mitigation strategies, have been successful, and I would say largely successful in preventing millions and millions of foreclosures. And that's great news. And one of the reasons why the CFPB is saying, hey, we want to make some of these loss mitigation strategies long-term rather than just a response to a crisis. And so then on the next slide, I'm going to look at some other signs of success from these responsible loss mitigation strategies during the pandemic. And this is actually data from auction.com that's showing where we are in terms of, on the left-hand side, completed foreclosure auctions. So we talked about that 98,000. This is really that a subset of that 98,000. When we look at our auction.com data, all this is benchmarked to 2019 levels. So if we think 2019 was a normal, so-called normal year in terms of foreclosures, which it was actually very low historically, but even compared to that historically low level of foreclosures that we had in 2019, we're seeing about 40 to 50% of those 2019 levels now. You do see that after the foreclosure moratorium ended in 2021, you did see foreclosure volumes come up a bit, but they're still running at that 40 to 50% of pre-pandemic levels when you look at both scheduled foreclosure auctions as well as completed foreclosure auctions. And then on the right-hand side, we have REOs, or bank repossessions is what I'd call them, properties that become real estate owned. They don't sell at the foreclosure auction. And those numbers are actually even lower relative to pre-pandemic levels. If you look at that 32%, and this is running through about mid-2024, we're seeing that these properties becoming REOs are running at about a third of the level as they were in 2019. So again, this is a huge marker of the success of the responsible loss mitigation that was put in place as a result of the pandemic and is now being kind of cemented into the long-term strategies of the mortgage servicing industry. And I think this is all good, that we're now seeing kind of a new normal in terms of foreclosure levels. They're not even getting back to that so-called what we might call normal level in 2019. So this is a success. The next slide actually shows how this shows up at the state level. And this is kind of a little bit of a sidebar. And if you're interested, you can take a shot of that QR code on the screen to dig into this heat map a little bit more. But this is really looking at that same completed foreclosure number relative to 2019 levels at a state level. And so there is, the sidebar here is just that there is a variance from state to state. So if we look at the two states here that are most concerning to the folks on the call, probably, if you look at California, we're at 55% of 2019 levels in terms of the foreclosure volume. So still well below that 2019 level. If you look at New York, it's actually at 50%, a little bit lower in terms of relative to pre-pandemic levels. But this is all good news. You're not seeing, it's not only that foreclosures are not coming back, we're not seeing a wave of foreclosures that maybe some people predicted would happen as a result of the pandemic. It's not only that, we're not even seeing foreclosures get back to those 2019 levels. And this is in large part to the response to the pandemic. And there are some states, though, that are even lower. Florida stands out at 26%. Texas is at 45%. But then there are also states that have come back and are closer to pre-pandemic levels. So this is a state view of what's happening. But again, I think all of this paints a picture of success of responsible loss mitigation strategies implemented during the pandemic. But then the next slide, I think we're going to switch gears a little bit because I want to raise the possibility that in the glare of all this success of the loss mitigation, we do risk a little bit ignoring the fact that there are still foreclosures happening. And we actually surveyed our clients at our Disposition Summit a couple of months ago as to, okay, there's a lot of loans that have gone into forbearance and then gone into loss mitigation, loan modification, whatever that loss mitigation is, maybe it's a partial claim. And we asked them, what % of your organization's loans in loss mitigation do you expect will permanently perform? And you can look at this as a glass half full or a glass half empty, but it's pretty much the same either way. they're saying they're estimating 51% of their loans will permanently perform that are in loss mitigation. That's actually, I think, really good news that slightly over half of these loans that got into trouble and were put into loss mitigation are going to permanently perform. But the glass half empty perspective is that there's still 49% that will not permanently perform. And my argument today is that we do also need to think about this, those loans, and the fact that those will be potentially going back into default, potentially entering the foreclosure process, and start thinking about, okay, we've seen success in what I would call a responsible loss mitigation strategy. Another way to think about it is a common sense loss mitigation strategy. Now let's apply that same responsible, common sense thinking to dispositions for these foreclosures that I would call are necessary. We've avoided a lot of unnecessary foreclosures, millions over the last couple of years, but there are still some necessary foreclosures that are coming down the pike and that are even happening now that we need to think about, okay, we don't want to ignore these. We want to approach these in the same way that is providing the best outcomes for everybody involved. So the next slide we'll get to that too. It gets to the point that, yes, a lot of these loss mitigation strategies have been very successful because they're innovative, they're common sense, they're streamlined, they're not just doing things the same old way as they've been done in the past. But a lot of the reason for the success also has to go to the fact that there's so much equity built up in this market. And homeowners who are getting into trouble have a lot of equity to work with. And that is helping to buoy the success of the loss mitigation. And we asked this at our Disposition Summit as well of our clients. And we asked, what's the average, combined loan to value ratio of the loans these loans in your portfolio? And what stands out to me is that the seriously delinquent inventory almost has as much equity as the overall inventory in their portfolio. So about 65% average CLTV is what they're estimating, which means they have 35% equity on average. So that's a huge amount of equity to work with, and part of the reason that we've seen such success in these loss mitigation programs. However, again, I guess the glass half full perspective here is that home equity is something that we can't necessarily rely on forever. It's a market condition that is a tailwind for the market and specifically for loss mitigation right now, but it could shift, and we can't rely on that long term. And the next slide actually gets to some of the consequences of the fact that these loss mitigation policies, they do help permanently stop a lot of foreclosures, but for some foreclosures, what these loss mitigation strategies are doing are just kicking the can down the road or deferring the foreclosure. And we looked at some of our own data here to see what is the consequence on the foreclosure timeline because of some of these loss mitigation strategies that have been implemented during the pandemic. And so what you're seeing there, the years at the bottom, on the bottom axis there, are the years of the initial foreclosure auction. And so we're looking at data in the auction.com database of properties that have been scheduled for foreclosure auction more than once. And so I call this a foreclosure spin cycle. They're scheduled, canceled, then rescheduled, and the blue line is showing how many times on average they're being rescheduled. And that has gone up from about 3 times on average rescheduled back in 2019 to now almost 4 reschedules for these properties that are in this kind of foreclosure spin cycle that are going in and out of foreclosure. And to me, the implication there is there's not necessarily a long-term solution for these folks. And then the green bars are showing the average days that these properties are in that foreclosure spin cycle. And that has gone up pretty dramatically. It's more than doubled from 188 days on average to now 479 days in 2023, which is the most recent complete year we have data for. And so these properties are, because of the more options available to them, they tend to be able to stop the foreclosure process at least temporarily, but then they're being rescheduled for foreclosure auction and they're going back into foreclosure. And that time is now that they're kind of in that cycle is well over a year, 479 days. And the implication, so this may not in itself seem like a bad thing. You're giving folks more time to figure things out. However, the next slide shows what's the implication on that home equity cushion that is so beneficial for these homeowners. And this is a bit of a complex slide, so I'll try to walk through it. But what we're showing there, if you look there at the bottom, the first auction date when they were first scheduled for auction, and then the most recent time that they were scheduled for auction. So again, these are properties that are kind of cycling in and out of foreclosure, being scheduled for auction, then canceled, and then rescheduled. In between that first auction date and the most recent auction date, which again now is about averaging 479 days, these folks are losing equity. The green bars show on average, at least on paper, if their homes are in fully repaired condition, which we know that they're probably not, unfortunately, they're losing about $10,000 in equity over that time, from $149,000, almost $150,000 in equity to $140,000 in equity on paper over that period. And the reason is, even though the values of the homes are going up, which the blue line shows that, the total debt burden that's owed on these properties is actually also going up, and it's going up at a faster pace than the values of the properties. And so that's resulting in eroding home equity for these homeowners. And I think the even worse news, unfortunately for these homeowners, is even though they have a lot of equity on paper, there's a subset of these properties in the foreclosure spin cycle that are actually eventually going to foreclosure auction. And that's the last category here on the chart. Those are the ones that are sold at auction. And of those subset, when they end up selling at auction, it shows that the actual value of the property is probably a lot less than what it looks like on paper. And so we're actually seeing, for those properties that sell at auction, they have a negative equity of about $5,000 rather than that equity of almost $140,000 that they may have thought they had on paper, if they look at the fully after repair value of the home. And so all of this to say is that there is a consequence. There is a consequence of deferring foreclosures and pushing foreclosures down the road, and that is lost equity. One of the big consequences is lost equity for the homeowners themselves. And if there's no long-term solution for those homeowners to avoid foreclosure, then giving them more time is really not helping them. It's just causing them to lose more equity in their home than they would have had if they had maybe sold the property earlier in the process. So this is setting the stage. I think one big thing that we need to think about is the lost equity for homeowners when we're thinking about responsible disposition. And then the next slide gets to some of the other things that we need to think about, which was in the title of this this session, which has to do with the neighborhood renewal. When we look at properties that are foreclosed on, yes, that's a situation we want to avoid if at all possible. But there is a bright side to these properties that are being foreclosed, because it allows the properties then to get into the hands of someone who will renovate the property and put it back into the retail market as performing quality housing. And that's what this slide is trying to show, is that when we look at properties that were foreclosed on auction.com, and this is going back to 2018 to 2023, we're seeing on average, when a property is foreclosed and then it's renovated and then put back on the market, we're seeing an average of 36 percent in value being added to that property between foreclosure and then when it returns to the retail market as a renovated home. And I don't have time to get into all the details of how that's calculated, but that's huge. And when we looked at this using FAA underserved area data, we looked at this for also minority census tracts and low income census tracts. And the value being added in those areas, those what I'd call underserved neighborhoods, is even higher, 40% in minority tracts and 43% in added value during renovation in the low income tracts. And on average, these properties are taking about 6 months, 187 to 188 days during renovation. So it's the folks who are doing this are pretty efficient about it. Within 6 months, they're adding 36 to 43 points in value to the property through renovation. And so that's when you have necessary foreclosures that are being held back from the market. This is one consequence, is you're holding back neighborhood renewal. You're holding back properties from being renovated and getting back into the retail market. And then the next slide. So the objection to this might be, well, yeah, you have all these investors coming in, adding 36 to 40 points in value to the properties. That's just gentrifying neighborhoods and causing unaffordable housing, and pushing out especially in minority and low income census tracts, that's causing displacement. People have to leave those neighborhoods because they can't afford them anymore because all these properties are being renovated. And this slide pushes back against that. I mean, what we see is, yes, the properties are being renovated and there's a lot of value being added to homes, but when they're resold on the market, they're still selling at affordable prices. And so what you see here on the left-hand side is properties that were renovated and then resold. And the average price is there on the blue bars that they're selling at. And this is again it's a pretty big group of properties between 2018 and 2023. The average price, $277,000. This is nationwide for these renovated foreclosures. And it's lower in minority tracts and low income census tracts. But I think more important than the actual average price is the percentage of income needed to buy these homes for a local family who lives in the neighborhood. And if you look at that, it's 25% of income, local family income, median family income, that you would need to afford to make the monthly house payments on these properties. That's very affordable. I would say that falls well below the threshold of what a lot of people are spending on homes these days to purchase homes. And by the way, with that piece, we're looking at not just the mortgage payment, but also taking into account, which, by the way, we're looking at the average interest rate at the time of purchase. And then we're also taking into account homeowners insurance and property taxes. So not just the mortgage, but also the other kind of so-called hidden costs of home ownership. So these properties are actually affordable, which may surprise some people. And then on the right-hand side there, we're looking at the home ownership rate. Well, maybe they're affordable, but a lot of these are ending up in the hands, the objection might be, a lot of these are ending up in the hands of investors rather than homeowners. We're actually showing, of the properties that are renovated and then resold, 73% of those are now owner occupied. We looked at tax assessor data from the counties to determine owner occupancy status, and we're seeing 73% of these renovated resales of foreclosures, previous foreclosures, are owner occupied, which is great news. A lot of these are getting into the hands of owner occupants. And even in minority and low income tracts where the homeownership rate is a little bit lower, it's still hovering around 70% of these are renovated foreclosures are getting into the hands of owner occupants. So this may fly in the face of conventional wisdom out there, but I think it's an important consequence of holding back necessary foreclosures and not embarking on what I call responsible disposition, is that you're holding back some of this opportunity for proper affordable housing to get back into the market, and affordable housing that largely is going to owner occupants, not to investors. All right, so hopefully I have set up a case so far for why we need responsible disposition. I want to talk next on the next slide about what do I really mean by responsible disposition, and there's 4 pillars for that. Competitive, innovative, transparent, and caring. And so competitive means that you're creating a marketplace when these properties, when you've exhausted all loss mitigation options and there's no long-term solution for that homeowner, you want to dispose of these properties in a competitive marketplace where they're getting the property is getting the highest and best offer possible. And I'll talk in a minute about why that's not only good for the servicers, but it's also good for the neighborhoods and also good for the distressed homeowner themselves. And I have some stats there about, how you could measure competitive using stats from auction.com. Innovative is the second pillar, and that's really just leveraging marketing and technology to attract the biggest pool of buyers possible to purchase these properties that are being foreclosed on through the disposition process. And one example that I have from auction.com is remote bid, which is something that we've created in the last few years that allows folks to bid on properties at foreclosure auction from their mobile phone. So they actually don't have to physically go to the courthouse steps to bid on the properties. And this is available in over 1,000 counties across the country. So we're really proud of that. And we initially actually created this to benefit our current buyers, but what we found is it started attracting new buyers who we didn't even have. And some of them are owner occupant buyers, people who can't take time off of their day jobs to go attend a foreclosure auction on the courthouse steps. They can now do that from their mobile phone and buy a property and compete with those investors that are out there and actually buy a home to live in. So that's been an example of innovation that I think is a huge part of a responsible disposition strategy. And then transparent, you want to provide as much information to both the buyers and the sellers as possible. And, in the past, if you went back to 2000, even 2005, and you went to the courthouse steps, you may not even know that a foreclosure auction is happening. It wasn't always very obvious. There was maybe just a group of a few people standing in a circle around another person. Now we believe, auction.com has been a big part of this, but there are other companies doing it as well that have made that auction much more transparent. So you know what's going on and information. And I think that's good for the process. And then the last element is caring, and approaching responsible disposition with a lens of, approaching disposition with a lens of not just minimizing your losses as a mortgage servicer, but also looking at how that disposition is impacting the community. And I've talked a little bit about that, some of the stats on that already, but that's just kind of a layer on top of the competitive, innovative, and transparent pillars that I think helps to really ensure that we're bringing about, that we're making the best of a bad situation and bringing about neighborhood renewal and providing affordable housing through responsible disposition. So that caring piece, a great example of that is, and this is a policy thing, is HUD back in August 2022 expanded their first look policy. So for properties that had been foreclosed, that were HUD insured loans, they instituted an expanded first look for owner occupants, a first look auction period that was exclusively for owner occupants and nonprofits. And so that was just saying, hey, look, we want to give just an extra opportunity to get these properties into the hands of responsible buyers. And we saw a great success out of that program when we implemented it on auction.com. Is the percentage of owner occupants buying these REO at REO auction on auction.com went from just 12% in 2021 to 20% in 2023. And I think that's largely the result of a pretty simple, I shouldn't say simple, but it took a lot of hard work, but a pretty elegant policy change that was made by HUD back in August 2022. All right. So, and then I'm going to breeze through the next few slides because I've talked a lot about these, but just to show how this responsible disposition can, when it's implemented, when you're implementing those 4 pillars of responsible disposition, the kind of impact it can make. And so, first of all, you're attracting, with a competitive, innovative, transparent marketplace, we end up attracting a lot more of a broader pool of more diverse buyers. And we call these folks local community developers. 78% of our buyers when we surveyed them this year said they were local community developers, meaning they're buying properties locally within a 100-mile radius, most of them a 100-mile radius of where they live. And they're small volume. They're mom and pop mostly. They're not big institutional investors. So, and just a side note on these folks, I mean, I've talked to several of them over the last few years, and they are really doing amazing things in their communities. The stories from these local community developers are just inspiring for me. And if you go to auction.com/in-the-news, we actually have documented on video quite a few of these folks who are buying at the auction on auction.com and then renovating these properties and then just doing a lot of good in their communities. So they really care about their communities. So that's number one. Next slide gets to kind of talking about what I talked about before in terms of getting these properties, that the necessary foreclosures that are happening, back into the retail market as quickly as possible. And what we see is when you dispose these properties earlier in the process, namely at the foreclosure auction, they tend to get back into the retail market faster. And maybe that's no surprise, but when we look at the properties that sell at foreclosure auction, on average, those are turning around, being renovated and getting back into the retail market in about 187 days, in about 6 months. But then if you look at the properties that don't sell at foreclosure auction and have to then go REO and sold on the traditional REO market, it's taking longer for those to get back into the retail market, more like a year for those to get back into the retail market. So that's one thing to think about as you're formulating a responsible disposition strategy, is what are the ways that we can get these properties back performing in the market as quickly as possible. And then the next slide gets to the home ownership rate. Again, we see that the properties that sell at auction, foreclosure auction, as opposed to traditional REO, tend to actually have a higher home ownership rate. That's 73% I talked about, as opposed to 66% for properties that sell traditional REO. I mean, the good news is in both cases, you have a very high home ownership rate for these properties. A lot of these are getting back into the hands of owner occupants. Next slide gets to the value added. We do see, I talked about this, at 36 points in value added to a property during renovation. And we see that much higher than when a property goes traditional REO. Usually there's no renovation prior to it selling as an REO. It sells as is. And so there's not only is it getting back to the retail market in a year rather than 6 months, but when it does get back to the retail market, it hasn't been renovated. And so there's another probably 6-month period for that property to be renovated before it's turned into what I'd call quality affordable housing. And then the next slide looks at affordability. And I did talk about this a little bit. The one thing I didn't talk about is not every property goes to owner occupant. There are some that are for sure that are held as rentals. And on the right-hand side here, we look at the rental affordability. And it's a little bit harder to measure this, but our estimates are that rental affordability is actually is really good on these renovated foreclosures as well, running at about from 23% of local income to rent across the board, all the way down to only 20% in low income census tracts to rent these properties. So it's affordable. And then going on to the next slide. This one is, I think, one that often is not thought about, but I think it's really important, is when properties sell at the foreclosure auction to these local community developers, there's an opportunity there to get the surplus funds from the sale back into the hands of that distressed homeowner who is unfortunately losing the property. And what we're showing is, and this is again 2018 to 2023 period, we're showing of the foreclosure auction sales we've done, around 40%, 38 to 40% of those end up with excess surplus funds above what's owed to the foreclosing lender. And actually, the number is a lot higher if you look at recent years where home prices have shot up. It's more like 50 to 55% of these sales are resulting in potential surplus funds. It's really home equity that goes back to the distressed homeowner. And what I think most servicers realize, but maybe is not thought about a lot, is that if that property doesn't sell at the foreclosure auction and goes REO, there's no opportunity at that point for the distressed homeowner to benefit from any equity that they had in the property. So they lose out on any chance for those surplus funds once the property goes REO. On the right-hand side, we just showed the average potential surplus amount that's left over from these sales that have surplus funds. And that's ranging from about 35,000 in low-income census tracts to 43,000. So, just to put that into simple terms, it's, a homeowner unfortunately loses, they have no long-term solution in loss mitigation. The property goes to foreclosure. They lose the property in foreclosure, which is not a great situation. But then there's that potential with these surplus funds in this situation for them to walk away with a check for $43,000 for any equity that they had in the property. And they may not have realized that they had equity, but the benefit of a transparent marketplace that I talked about earlier is that it brings a lot of buyers in and it pushes up the price of that property to the market price. And the true market price, and that price realization often results in maybe equity that the homeowner didn't even, or the servicer may not even realize that the property had. So this is a big deal that I wanted to point out before I close. And I think this is actually the last slide I have. So Susan, I will turn it back to you, and maybe we have a couple of questions that I can address as well.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions, but thank you so much. That was great information, great, demonstration of how, the distressed homeowner can be helped as well as the neighborhoods, and try to bring value into a delicate situation created by, the borrower going into foreclosure in the first place. So you talk about, the fact that these homes can get back on the market. How can originating lenders participate in that process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a piece of this I hadn't thought about as much, but I think it's certainly important to this audience. But these folks who are buying the properties at auction, these distressed properties, these are great customers, I think, for a loan, a mortgage company, a loan originator to have. And so I think just strategically thinking about marketing to these types of, again, what we call local community developers in a community who are going to be repeat customers, right? They're buying, our data shows that our buyers are buying about 10 properties a year off of auction.com, most of these folks, or 10 or fewer, but still, they're repeat customers who are doing this every year. And so strategically identifying and marketing to those types of potential borrowers and customers, because a lot of them now, when they buy at auction, a lot of times they'll have to buy with cash, but they will often immediately be looking to refinance those properties. And so those are a great pool of potential customers, I think, for loan originators out there.
So you talked about the local community developers being a part of this process too. Would that include like local nonprofit housing organizations as well?
Absolutely, yes. We tried to broaden that term because we do think there's a lot of nonprofits, and there are nonprofits who are buying off of auction.com that I've talked to who are doing great work. I think of the Youngstown Neighborhood Development Corporation. Is just one great example of that up in Youngstown, Ohio. And we have other organizations like that buying off of auction.com and doing great work. So it definitely includes that segment, but we broaden it out to be local community developers because we found that there's a lot of, local buyers who are for profit, who are doing great work as well, and actually are functioning in many ways in the same way that nonprofits are, even though they're doing it for a profit. So that's what that term is meant to include.
All right, wonderful. Well, Daren, thank you so much for this really helpful information. I enjoyed the presentation, and thanks to all of you for joining us on today's presentation. I want to thank my partners at the New York MBA for helping put this content together to provide to you all. Here's some contact information either for New York MBA or the California MBA if you'd like to participate in any of our upcoming events or become a member of either of our organizations. Thanks again for joining us today, and everybody have a great rest of your day.